It turns out that research shows there's literally only one thing that works if you really want to know what someone else is thinking and feeling. And that one thing is to ask them. But we don't get trained on how to ask them. We think, oh, we're human beings. We talk. We know how to ask questions. But asking people questions is a skill. And the good news is that it's a learnable skill. But it doesn't, we're not born with it necessarily.
Greetings, everyone, and welcome to Unleashed, the fastest hour on the internet, where every episode I'm joined by a best-selling author or accomplished leader who shares common sense leadership ideas, all in the name of helping you make a greater impact. I'm your host, Jeff Tetz. Most leaders feel their business could perform better. At Results, we help leadership teams achieve their bold visions by providing a unique system of accountability and ongoing coaching to create more predictable and successful outcomes. Reach out for a conversation at unleashresults.com. Well, here's a harsh truth. We do a lousy job of tapping into the insights of the people around us, and it takes a toll on our organizations and it erodes our most valued relationships. But it doesn't have to be that way. I'm joined today by Jeff Wetzler to discuss his new book entitled Ask, where he'll share tips and strategies for creating more transparent relationships and tapping into the goldmine of insights around you. The essential question animating Jeff's career, whether in working with children, educators, or executives, has always been, how can we create learning experiences that are deep, powerful, and enduring? In 2015, Jeff co-founded Transcend, an organization that supports communities to create and spread extraordinary, equitable learning environments. Prior to Transcend, Jeff spent a decade in senior leadership roles at Teach for America, a national nonprofit dedicated to educational opportunity for all children, where his teams focused on optimizing the training and ongoing support of TFA's thousands of members nationally. Jeff worked at an international consulting firm advising executives, focusing on strategy, adult learning, and organizational development, and he's passionate about advancing innovation in education systems and about improving learning and school design. Jeff lives in New York with his wife and 2 kids who constantly fuel his inspiration and urgency in his work. Jeff, welcome to Unleashed.
Thank you. So good to be with you.
So pleasure to speak with you. And now I understand, so you live just outside of New York. I'm, of course, located in Edmonton, Alberta, which is really close to the Rocky Mountains. But you actually have some really important experiences that have happened in the Canadian Rockies. I wonder if you could expand on that.
Oh, I love the Canadian Rockies. I actually got engaged there. My wife and I were hiking, and on that very same trip, we spent about a week in the backwoods on a horseback trip, where the whole entire goal of the horseback trip was to see grizzly bears. And as you may know, you can do a lot more getting up close to a grizzly bear when you're on a horse than you can when you are just walking there by yourself. And so we got quite close. And it turned out that my wife discovered she does not really like horseback riding, so she would walk alongside the horse. But the first time we saw a grizzly bear, she got right on the horse and she was back to riding. How
many grizzly bears did you actually encounter?
I would say we probably saw a good 3 to 5. We were actually with a ranger who had a tracker. And so he would kind of point us towards where the grizzly bears were.
So I do a fair amount of backcountry camping in the summers, and about 7 years ago, we had a close encounter with a grizzly bear. And I'll tell you, we usually try to avoid them. We're not seeking them. And so I didn't even know there was such an expedition, if you will, that exists. So I'm going to have to check that out.
It was unforgettable.
No, hey Jeff, I'm delighted that you could join us here, and I'm really looking forward to digging into this conversation and your book, Ask. And as it turns out, which is probably not going to come as a surprise to most of our listeners, but we don't do a very good job of tapping into the insights of the people around us. But there's another component to this, is like, even for yourself, as you highlight in the book, is you were born a very curious person. And then your experience as a magician kind of lended itself to conditioning you to keep your cards closer to your chest, and kind of you became a little bit more incurious. There's another analogy that kind of sticks out to me, is this is a little bit like middle school, where it seemed like it was like your significant other's friends that were the first to know if they were going to break up with you, and you were like the last to know. And
Yep.
I think that dynamic is at play in the workplace here. But my question, does every single one of us kind of get conditioned to be less curious as we grow up?
I think it varies by person, but by and large, yes. And some of it I think is biological and neurological in our wiring. As we just have more experience in the world, we start to construct models of the world just to help us stay sane. And once we have a model of the world, we forget that it's just a model. And so there's less that we're curious about. And I think that's natural. But I also think many of us go to schools that send the message that it's more important to get it right and have the answer than to ask questions. And little by little, we see that. And then we work in organizations where sometimes there can be sort of social norms that say a leader is the person who's supposed to know the right answer and go forward and take people forward, as opposed to be curious or uncertain or ask a question. And so there's a whole range of different things that I think, inside of us and outside of us lead us to ask fewer questions and even feel less curious.
Okay, so that's interesting, because I understand, like, I totally get the conditioning piece of at school, academically, we're rewarded for knowing the right answers. But something else that you said there, so it's like this expectation when we're promoted into leadership roles. It sounds like what you said, if I heard you correctly, there are expectations placed upon us by others that we're expected to know the answers. Did I hear you? Is that correct?
Yeah, obviously everything varies by the organization, but by and large, a lot of organizational cultures place more value on certainty and confidence and, quote, strong leadership that looks more like I know what we're supposed to do. And that can lead us to take in the message, gosh, if I don't know the answer, I shouldn't admit it. I should tell my team, here's where we're going. And I'm not saying that this is necessarily the right message, but I do think it's a common message.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And what's at stake here? I mean, what are the consequences to organizations if we can't figure this out?
Yeah. So I think what's at stake is really two things. One is the results we get, and two is the quality of our relationships. And I'll unpack that a bit. The core premise that I write about in the book is that every single one of us is surrounded by people, whether those are people we manage, people who manage us, our clients, our customers, our investors, vendors, other stakeholders, and all of the people around us have information, ideas, perspectives, insight, feedback that if we knew what was in their heads, we would make better decisions. We would save time. We would innovate better together. But far too often, and we can get into the data, but far too often, they don't tell us what's actually in their heads, or all of what's in their heads, or even the most important stuff that's in their heads. And so we stay in the dark, and we miss out on those opportunities. I think that's really what's at stake. There's a collective intelligence around us and inside of every organization that too often stays dormant or gets suppressed as opposed to being activated.
Yeah, and we're going to get into some, I think, like the nitty-gritty of what prevents people from speaking up, and then how we can start to tap into that collective intelligence. There's something else that you raise in your book, though, is that quite often, and I think it's a blind spot, we're weakening the relationships around us, the ones that we really value the most. Like, what are some of the common, I guess, behaviors that you see that erode our most precious relationships?
Well, if we're, let's say we're having an impact on somebody around us, let's say it's somebody that we are managing, and unbeknownst to us, we're acting in ways that demotivate them or that offend them or hurt them. If we don't find that out, they're going to become alienated from us. They're going to draw further away from us. And conversely, if we can understand, here's what I'm doing, here's how I'm playing into the relationship, we have an opportunity to repair that, and actually speak to what's meaningful to people around us. And so often, if somebody is around us and not really getting a chance to tell us what they know, think, and feel, that itself is a cost that they pay. But if we actually can allow someone to tell us what they really know, we're sending the message to them that we value them.
Yeah. And you've developed, I think, was a very straightforward 5-step methodology to start correcting that and improving that dynamic. You'd suggest, though, that before you dive in and start applying these 5 principles, it's important to pause and reflect in terms of understanding why people don't share. So why is it important to stop and reflect on that first?
Well, I think like any problem that you're trying to solve, and I look at this unspokenness among the people around us as a real problem. You get a lot further faster if you can understand what's causing the problem so that you can be dealing with the root cause of it. And I can tell you from my own personal experience as a leader, I have had many instances where I haven't found out, or I found out only too late, that there are things that the people around me know and think and feel that they're not telling me. And so that's what got me curious. It's like, why wouldn't you have just told me? If you knew it, how come you didn't tell me? But I'm trying to take a kind of an inquiry stance and be like, no, really, what are the barriers? And I'm happy to share, but in the research for the book, several things continue to come up over and over again as to the reasons why people don't share with us.
Yeah, and and you say that there's actually, you've kind of broken them into 4 themes,
That's right.
which I think is interesting. And the most prevalent one, again, I don't think it'll catch anybody off guard, but it's like it's the fear, it's the worry about the impact of sharing that prevents people from speaking up. And why is that fear of repercussion, or the fear of what the impact it might have? Why is that such a pervasive feeling amongst people?
Well, if they care about us, they don't want to have a negative impact on us. They don't want to hurt us. They don't want to offend us. They don't want to burden us. But also, if we have any kind of power over them, they also don't want us to take it out on them and have a negative impact on them. And if they care about our relationship, they don't want to put tension into the relationship. So all of those are kinds of impacts that are the number one reason why people really hold back.
Yeah. How true is it, do you think? Like when you say people don't want to offend us, like I sometimes wonder if that's like a cop-out or something we tell ourselves just to avoid discomfort. But do you think that that's actually a valid concern, is that we don't want to hurt each other's feelings?
I think it depends on the situation and on the person, but I do think there's a lot of people who don't want to hurt someone else. Sometimes it's because they genuinely care about that person. Sometimes it's because they feel like, well, if I hurt that person, then he's going to get defensive, and I don't have to deal with the defensiveness as well, because there's a lot of different flavors of it.
Yeah. So, and Jeff, how important, before you start approaching a colleague and starting to have some of these more curious conversations, like how important is it to understand or isolate which of the 4 areas they might be struggling with speaking up in?
I think you don't need to kind of do an explicit analysis to pinpoint it, but I think it's useful as background knowledge to be thinking maybe they are feeling like they don't want to hurt me or impact our relationship. Maybe they don't even realize that I value what they have to say. Maybe they're rushing and don't have time. So just to kind of have that in your mind, and then especially when we get into the part about making it safe, it's useful to understand that.
Got it. So it's more about generally being aware that there are multiple reasons why somebody might not be sharing their true feelings.
And usually it's more than one reason.
Yeah, good point. Really good point. Now, one of the other 4 areas that people sometimes don't share with us is that they're lacking time and energy. So, and that one really hit home, because I like in the work that we do with leadership teams, we're finding right now it's hard to find good people. There's lots of opportunities, and by and large, companies are struggling with capacity challenges for a number of reasons. And so like a lot of people are maxed out, they're overwhelmed, they don't have time for anything else. So how might you test whether or not the culprit with your own colleagues' lack of speaking up is because they're just lacking time and energy?
Well, I mean, ultimately the best way to test anything is to ask the person. And so if you end up saying, what made it hard for you to share this, or what would make it hard for you to share this, and to what extent is it about your time or your bandwidth? That's a direct way to go at it. But I think another way to test it is to, when you're actually trying to have that conversation with the person, be thoughtful about when works for them, be thoughtful about creating more space for them to do it. And so you can try to reduce that barrier and see if that makes a difference as well.
Yeah. And Jeff, whether there's an elaboration here or not, but I found it really interesting that the way that our brain thinks about threats is that we feel the same threat from like speaking up and conversational risk as we do about an actual physical threat. I wonder, is there anything you want to expand on there?
Well, I found that research to be just completely striking. And the idea that I am going to hesitate to touch a hot pan or put my hand in the fire or get punched in the face is natural. And then the thought that actually that my brain functions the exact same way if I'm thinking that someone might judge me or reject me or that this might end our relationship. If it's that viscerally painful in that same way, to me, that gives me a lot of understanding and empathy as to why people might hold back or be cautious about sharing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Now, Jeff, is this a good time to segue into some of the 5 steps then? So
Absolutely.
we understand a little bit about some of the reasons why people don't speak up. And you've come up with sort of 5 reasons, or 5, I guess, tips or steps that we can start to take to curb that. Before we dig into that, though, you suggest we're really bad at interpreting what people are really thinking correctly. What are some of the ways that we misinterpret what our people are actually thinking?
Yeah. So none of what I'm talking about would be a problem. We wouldn't even be having this conversation. I wouldn't have written this book if we were actually any good at knowing what someone else is thinking and feeling by reading their minds, or by observing them. And many of us think we're better at it than we are. But there's fascinating research that shows none of us is very good. Even trained, security agents at the airport are not particularly good at this. And some of the most common advice that we get for how to do this just doesn't work. So, for example, read their body language. Nope. That kind of thing does not work. Try to put yourself in their shoes. Nope, doesn't work. It turns out that research shows there's literally only one thing that works if you really want to know what someone else is thinking and feeling. And that one thing is to ask them. But we don't get trained on how to ask them. We think, oh, we're human beings. We talk. We know how to ask questions. But asking people questions is a skill. And the good news is that it's a learnable skill. But it doesn't, we're not born with it necessarily.
Yeah, well, great. Take me to school, Jeff. And so the 5 steps that you have in the ask process. So I want to summarize these for our listeners, and then we can dig in. So number 1 is choose curiosity. Number 2, make it safe. Number 3 is pose quality questions. The 4th is listen and learn. And then the 5th is reflect and reconnect. So I would love it if you could give us a crash course on each of the 5.
Absolutely. So you've just summarized for us the 5 practices of the ask approach.
Yeah.
Each of these is grounded in scientific research. Each of these is tested in practice. And when we put them together, they give us the best possible chance of truly learning from the people around us, truly accessing the insights and wisdom that they have to teach us. So I can just walk through them one by one if you like.
Yeah, sure. And Jeff, if you're willing to sort of go sequentially this way, let's start with choose curiosity.
Absolutely. And there's a reason why that's number 1, because any question that we ask someone needs to come from a place of genuine, authentic curiosity. If we are just trying to put a tactic into motion or, apply a question, but we're not really curious, they will see through that, and it won't work. But conversely, if we are truly curious, that energy generates a desire in the other person to share more with us. And I'm talking about curiosity here, not as a trait that some people have and other people don't, or a state of mind, like I'm feeling curious today or I'm not. I'm really talking about it as a choice that is available to all of us all of the time. And it's a decision to really center one question in our minds anytime we're interacting with a person or a group of people. And that question is, what can I learn from them? And if I'm centering that question, what can I learn from them? That starts to push away from my mind other things like they're wrong, or what can I teach them, or how do I get them to do what I want to do? I'm really on a search for what can I learn from them. And underneath that question is a whole bunch of other really interesting, what I call curiosity questions that we can ask ourselves, like what might they see that I don't see? What experiences might they've had? How do they look at this world, a situation that's very different than the story I'm telling myself? How might they see me engaging in ways that I can't even see myself? What's the impact that I'm having on them? So there's a whole bunch of things that we can learn from people if we center that question in our mind. So that's really what choosing curiosity starts with.
Yeah, and you suggest like curiosity is the right approach, but it's the hard approach. And there are a few common culprits that you call them curiosity killers.
Yes.
What are the curiosity killers?
Yes. So the number 1 curiosity killer is when we get emotionally hijacked. And so, if I am, as a human being, this happens to me more often than I would like. But, if I get really upset or frustrated or pissed off at somebody, all of a sudden, that's what floods into my head. And I lose the question, what can I learn from this person? In the book, I tell a story about, somebody who's on my team at work, and I had asked them to do something. And I basically got like nope, not going to do it. And all of a sudden, my stories jump to they're being disrespectful. They're not a team player. I'm sacrificing myself, and they're not, all those kinds of things. But it was really the emotional hijacking that was going on for me until my co-CEO Elon said to me, what if you got a little more curious? What if something was going on? And it turned out once I got more curious, I discovered they were actually making the exact right decision, the decision I would have wanted them to make. I just didn't realize all the other things that they were juggling, but I needed to get unhooked from that emotion. And so I talk about how, while even though that's a curiosity killer, there's a way in which we can actually shift that to be a cue for curiosity. So just the same way, think about like if we leave a rubber band on the door because as a reminder to do the dishes or a reminder to put out the mail or that kind of thing, we can start to build an awareness of our own emotions to say, oh, I'm getting triggered now. This is the time when I need to actually step back, take a deep breath, and get more curious as well. And so we can, with practice, actually flip it and use our emotions to say, like, when I'm furious, that is when I get curious.
And to what extent can you flip it? Like, can you get to a point where you used to get completely hijacked by your emotions to becoming a person that doesn't get hijacked by them at all? Like, what does that look like in your experience?
So it takes time and takes practice. But one of the things that it takes, and I think the story I told illustrates this, is it can be a team sport. If you can enlist a friend, a partner, a colleague, and say to them, look, I want to get more curious. When you see me get triggered emotionally, remind me, this is the time I want to get curious. You're kind of triggered right now. What you be missing? How can you be more curious? Other ways that people do it are through journaling or through meditation or through therapy or through coaching or, any number. There's a bunch of different ways that one can do it, but many of them involve enlisting others to help us do that too.
Yeah. Well, and timely conversation. I mean, with the passing of Daniel Kahneman, of course, a few weeks ago, just a legend and a giant in the work, in the field of organizational psychology and human behavior. I had a call with Annie Duke last week, and he was a mentor of Annie Duke's, and I've had Annie Duke on the program a couple of times, but she talked about one of Danny's superpowers was he was just so innately curious all of the time about everything, like about the work that he would have been, you would think, most proud of. He wanted you to poke holes in it immediately. And she reflected on her own relationship with curiosity and like the things that he would just be instantaneously curious about. She would need like 6 weeks to come back from critical feedback. He would need 6 seconds, but she's gradually worked herself to a point where maybe it takes her 6 hours now and not 6 weeks. So I think
perfect example. This is learnable. Yeah, I love that story.
And it's like this whole notion of don't worry about perfection, just focus on improvement, that kind of thing. Jeff, what are some other curiosity killers that you've come across?
Yeah, there's two other big ones. One of them is just kind of time pressure, rush, sense of urgency. Like when we are feeling like we don't have the time. We got to move to this, next thing. Our brains are more in the kind of get it done mode than the, I wonder if mode. And I, in my work life, I have a colleague and she and I would sometimes get into very tense discussions. And I noticed that what was usually going on when we were getting into these tense discussions that were not as productive was that we had like 30 things that we were trying to discuss, in a 20-minute meeting. And we were just feeling like, I got to get to the next one. And so what we started to do is we actually said, you know what, once in a while, maybe once a month, we just need to take a walk with no agenda, give ourselves an hour to just kind of like get a little more curious about how each other's seeing the world, what's motivating you to push for this and me to push for this. And when we did that, all of a sudden it was like, yeah, there is a lot more, another way to look at what she's saying and what I'm saying. And so when we can start to depressurize things from a time perspective, and it doesn't have to take hours and hours, but it's just give it a little bit of a release valve. It allows the curiosity to seep back in.
Yeah, I feel like you've been following me around, Jeff, because those first two curiosity killers are definitely in my playbook. And what I'm learning over time is that anytime I don't show up as a version of myself that I aspire to, it's so important to take some reflection time and figure out what was going on there. And you've just put a great label around it, because I can think of, even doing this podcast, I can think of being in my car on the way to the studio and all of a sudden getting into a really important conversation with a colleague, and I got to be in the studio in 3 minutes, and there's like 35 minutes left of conversation here, and I start to get really impatient and intolerant. So that one really resonates. And I think what I've tried to do as a learning from that is create some rules for myself, that I don't answer my phone in between meetings. I don't check my emails. I'm trying to get more intentional with how I sort of allocate my time to avoid some of those situations that cause me to be incurious.
I think those are great tactics to use and very concrete. And that's exactly what they do. They create more spaciousness for you to allow that curiosity. The last one I was just going to, yeah.
Jeff, yeah, go ahead, man. Go ahead.
The last one I talk about as pressures for conformity. And so I talked a little bit earlier about the pressures that sometimes people and leaders can feel in organizations to feel like you got it together, you got the answers. But I also think that there's other pressures for conformity that we feel around even what do we think about a particular issue. If we're part of a community that like largely is on X side of this issue or Y side of another issue, all of a sudden the people around us can be a little bit more like, don't you agree this? Don't you think this? What about those other people? And so when we start to surround ourselves, or our social media feeds, or even the newspapers we read, or the shows we watch, or the podcasts we listen to, continually kind of reinforce our worldview, all of a sudden that also starts to shut down our curiosity, because it just cements the mental models in our minds that lead us to tell the same stories over and over again about a person or an issue or a situation that we're in.
Yeah. So just like with the other two, what's the antidote for conformity, pressure to conform?
There's a couple things. I mean, the biggest one I would say is diversity. If we can surround ourselves in our personal lives and in our organizational lives with people who have different backgrounds than us, and that could be on any dimension, whether that's on a political view, race, gender, all different kinds of identity markers. That's one of the greatest things to help us get out of this kind of like bubble that we're in as well. And another way to do it, even in a more kind of micro tactical type of way, is that if we're in a situation and it seems like we're all kind of agreeing on the same page here, we could just ask ourselves or ask the group the question, what would be the dissenting view here if there was one? What voices are missing around this table right now? Just to begin to get out of that conformity bubble.
Mm-hmm. Right on. Jeff, let's maybe segue into the second one. So the second one being make it safe. I like to call the make it safe one, make it easy. But what does make it safe? What does that one look like?
Yeah, so that's basically saying that even if I'm deeply curious to learn from you, if I have not actually, like if you don't feel safe to tell me your truth, a hard truth, it doesn't matter how curious I am, because I'm not going to get it from you. And I remember in one of my first operating roles, I was in charge of hundreds of people. We had many high stakes events going on, and one of them almost nearly blew up in a very public and high stakes, consequential kind of way. And I was thinking to myself, how did this happen? Because all year long, I had been talking to the team and asking questions, and I thought everyone was saying, well, there's a few bumps, but we're on it. What it turned out was they didn't actually feel safe telling me the challenges and struggles that they were facing, which was really unfortunate, because I could have helped in a whole bunch of ways had I actually known. And so, my first emotional reaction was like, why the hell didn't they tell me? But very quickly, I have to take it back to myself and say, what did I do that created conditions that were not safe for them? And so making it safe is really about making it as comfortable, easy, and appealing as possible for other people to tell us hard truths.
Right. And one of the suggestions you have to do that, you refer to it as flattening the hierarchy. And yes. So what would that look like at work?
Yeah, there's a few different ways that you can flatten the hierarchy. One of them is literally about the time and space when you're connecting with people. And so as part of the book, I interviewed some iconic CEOs, organizations like Kraft, Medtronic, and I said to them, CEOs are notorious for being insulated from the truth in their own organizations. People tell them what they think they want to hear. How did you do that? And so they talked about this strategy of basically saying what Bill George from Medtronic said, if I want to learn the truth from someone, I would never invite them into my office, make them sit across the big CEO desk from me, which is a huge symbol of hierarchy, and assume that they're going to feel comfortable telling me the truth. No, we're going to sit on the couch. We're going to take a walk. Others said things like, I'm going to go have lunch with them where they have lunch. I'm going to go to their car and we're going to do a sales call together. And so it's really about, get on their terms, their turf, their time. So that's one piece of flattening the hierarchy.
Yeah. People, when I hear you tell that story, I'm like, okay, that makes sense. And some great examples from actual CEOs of how they do that. But it also occurs to me, like, people are pretty adept at telling us what we want to hear as well, right? How do you start to gauge whether you really are getting to the heart of the truth?
Yeah. Well, so there's a few other things I think to do that can increase the chances of doing that. And then I'll just come back to your question. Another thing is to really explain to them why you're asking the question.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times, whether you're a CEO or a leader of any kind, or really in any position, people are guessing what's your agenda. Do they really want to know what you have to say or
Yeah.
not? And so if you can say to people, here's why I'm asking this question. And by the way, part of the reason I'm asking is because I'm actually uncertain myself. I really don't know. There's something I need to learn from you, or here's a mistake that I have made. And so all those different things I think also flatten the hierarchy, and make people much more likely to tell you the truth. I don't think we can ever know for sure whether someone is truly telling us the truth, but there's a whole set of questions that we can ask and follow-up questions that we can ask and ways that we can listen to see how consistent are the answers that they're giving us, how believable are the answers that they're giving us. And so I think those are some of the tests.
No, that's good. I think about transparency or quality of conversations as a puzzle that'll never be completed. And it's like, I'm always trying to think about how am I placing just a few more pieces of this puzzle over time. And we'll never have the complete picture, but I think it's really about just having a better picture as time goes on.
Exactly. Triangulating it.
Yeah, for sure. Now, the third piece of this is around quality questions. And one of the things about the book I love is you give such concrete examples of what great questions are. You take the guesswork out of it, Jeff. I love it. Like, you give people a foundation that they can build on. So I think that's going to increase the probability people start using the things that you talk about in your book. But I wondered, higher level, what does a good question consist of?
Yeah. So my definition for a quality question is very simply, it's a question that enables us to learn something important from someone else. And to unpack that a little bit more, it's a question that comes from genuine curiosity. It's a question that allows people to answer it however is true for them in terms of the full totality of their experience. So, for example, if somebody doesn't have a specific data point, but we say to them, "What's your data? What's your information?" We're never going to get the gut feeling or the intuition. So a question can really be kind of like, "Where's that come from?" Or what makes you think or feel that way, or even tell me a story. Those kinds of questions that can really get to the full range of people's experience. And it's also a question that, is what I call kind of a clean question. It's not a question that tries to lead somebody to an answer that we think we're going to get them, or sometimes embeds like 4 questions at once and they don't know which one that they're supposed to answer, or says a question then says our point of view and they're like, well, do you want me to answer your question or you want me to so there's a whole bunch of things that can make a question not as clean or straightforward. Those are some properties of quality questions.
Yeah, that's good. How are you familiar at all with David Marquet?
Yes, I am. I'm a big fan.
Okay, and I've had some conversation with him, and I love that he refers to certain questions as dirty questions, right?
Yeah,
So when you know the answer, but you're just trying to really make a colleague look bad. So
I call those sneaky questions or attack questions, depending. Yeah. But those are never going to get you the truth from someone. At minimum, they're going to just make that person feel manipulated, if not offended.
Yeah, that's good. And do you recommend, like, as a person starting to use the ask framework, like I'm almost envisioning there's like there's a little cue card or something that you're carrying around with you that's got the core questions that you want to be asking everybody over time. Like, is that something that you would recommend?
Yeah, I think that there's a taxonomy of questions, just the same way that any expert or practitioner would have their set of tools. If you are in management or leadership, one of your most important tools is questions that you're going to ask. And so why not have it as a toolbox as well? And there's, in the book, there's summary guides of the specific questions, so you don't have to go back to every single page of the questions. And there's more on the website as well in terms of these kinds of resources.
Yeah.
But absolutely. And I look at it a little bit like a repertoire. Most of us have a pretty narrow repertoire of questions that are natural for us. And this is really just about expanding our repertoire to other questions beyond our typical go-to questions. Do you want me to give you a few examples of quality questions that
Sure,
are
yes,
often
please.
overlooked? One of the biggest kinds of questions that I think is undervalued is a question strategy that I call request reactions. And this is simply to say to somebody else, what's your reaction to what I just said? How did that strike you? How does that land with you? What might I be missing? Because so often we think that if once we say our piece, if someone has a reaction to it, they're going to tell us their reaction. But quite often, for all the reasons we were just talking about, whether because of hierarchy or other fears that people have, especially if they disagree with us, we're not going to know that. And then we're going to miss out on a lot of information. But if we just simply say to someone, hey, what was your reaction to that? Or how did that land with you? Or how did that strike you? We're far more likely to send the message to them, I value what you have to say. And they're far more likely to actually give us something we can then work with. So that would be one category.
And you recommend like asking those in the moment, in the conversation. This is not something that you schedule a follow-up meeting to ask, right?
Totally. And I think that I'm glad you raised that, because I think that deals with some of the misconceptions. Some people have said like, well, doesn't it take so long? You have to ask all these questions. I'm like, no, you can just do it. Takes you less than 2 seconds to say, hey, how'd that land with you? It's just something you can do real time right there in the moment.
Yeah, no, that's good. Jeff, did you want to share any other examples of questions?
I'm happy to. I mean, I'll say one other category that I find particularly generative is as a strategy that I call just invite ideas. And so it's literally just to say to someone, hey, here's my dilemma. How might you handle that? Or hey, here's what's going on. What ideas come to mind for you? Because people around us have a bunch of ideas, and sometimes they don't even realize they have the ideas. But if we can take the moment and we can just invite them to be part of the solution, that can broaden the set of things the considerations that we have. And that can be done at an individual level or at an organizational level to really unearth tremendous ideas that are usually, especially close to the front line in organizations.
Yeah, those are great. I mean, even those examples you share, I can imagine how I might feel if a colleague was asking me for those answers, right? Like that's, wow, you would just feel so invited in to the organizations, be part of the solution, tapping into all of the insights and experiences that I might have that nobody is aware of. Like that's powerful.
Totally. You are part of the solution now.
Yeah. So the fourth area is what you call listen and learn. And I wondered, Jeff, like what does good listening look like?
Yeah. So there's a big difference between the listening that we think we do and actually hearing the essence of what someone has to say. Yeah. And good listening is not just about listening for the content of what someone has to say, although that's really important. The content would be like the facts, the figures, the claims, the assertions, all that kind of thing. There's two other types of listening, or two other channels that we need to listen through that matter just as much. The second one is emotion. What are the feelings that someone is expressing or displaying in a conversation? What's the affect that they're bringing to a conversation? Sometimes that's actually the most important thing going on in a conversation. Maybe someone is feeling scared. Maybe someone is feeling hurt. Maybe, who knows what it is, but that's the second channel. And then the third one is actions. Actually noticing and observing what they're doing. Are they pushing back? Are they asking for help? Are they repeating themselves? Are they getting behind what you have to do and supporting you? There's a whole set of actions that people are taking. And if we could start to listen through these three channels, the content, the emotion, and the action, we can usually triple the amount of information that we're actually taking in from somebody else in a conversation and really getting to the heart of what's most important.
Okay. Now, is part of the listening well, though, because we've already talked about the fact that we don't do a very good job of reading body language. We don't really do a good job of correctly assessing somebody's intent or motivation. So after we've taken in those three things, do we then have to come back with some good questions to confirm or clarify what we think we're picking up?
Exactly. Yeah, we shouldn't just say, oh, they're smiling, they must love what I have to say. Maybe they're smiling because they're nervous. Maybe, who knows what it is. So I really appreciate that point that you made, which is that we're taking this in, But listening doesn't stop with just taking it in and saying, I got it. A lot of what listening involves follow-up questions. And I can just name a couple of categories of follow-up questions that I think are especially high leverage or important. One of them is what I call paraphrase and test. And this is simply to say back to the other person, here's what I think I heard you say, or here's what I think I heard, here's the feeling I think I heard you express, to your feelings point. Um, did I get that right? How close is that? What would you modify about what I had to say? And it is fascinating to me how rarely we do that, but also how powerful that is. It does several things. Number one is it just slows down the conversation. So if we're at a heated moment or point of tension, it just kind of slows us down for a second. Two is, of course, it gives us the chance to actually correct any misconceptions of what we heard. And I will tell you, when I do that, at least 50% of the time, someone doesn't just say, exactly, you nailed it. They say, well, sort of, but here's this other piece that I hadn't gotten or heard the first time. But it also sends such an important message to the person we're talking to with, which is, I care enough about deeply understanding what you're trying to convey that I'm going to take the time to check if I got it right. So
Yeah.
it's just you get all those benefits with such a quick and easy move.
The fifth component to the ask method is reflect and connect. What does that one look like?
Yeah, so this is my favorite one. I am a self-confessed kind of like learning nerd and junkie for for growing and learning. And reflection is really what enables us to get the insight and the meaning from other people. It's not enough just to have the conversation and walk away. Reflection is really about how do we know what to do with it. And I think sometimes reflection gets a bad rap. People think, well, that's just something that, I don't have time for, or maybe monks do that if they're meditating, but like who really has to? But reflection can be very structured and very simple and very practical. In the chapter of the book, I use a method. I talk about a method called sift it and turn it. And sift it is really first just saying, of all the things I heard, now I'm going to think back to them, or I'm going to look back at my notes. What is the small number of things that really matter? And what can I let go? Because not everything that someone tells us is equally important. And so first we got to sift it and say, really, here's the good stuff. Sometimes it's helpful to get our friends or colleagues or partner to help us sift it so that we don't accidentally sift out the good stuff. But once we have the two or three, like these are the most important things that I got from this, then we reflect on it. And what that means is we turn it. So there's three what I call reflective turns that we can make. The first one is a question we ask ourselves that just says, how did what I hear affect or shift the story I'm telling about a situation? Maybe it helped me see that, they're different than I thought they were. There's another issue at play here, or that kind of thing. The second turn is, so what steps am I going to take based on that? So converting that into action. And the third is there anything I heard here that might have something deeper for me? Like, is it something that actually maybe exposes or challenges or pushes on like a deeper assumption or a bias or a worldview or way of being that I have in the world? And so those three turns are what I call the story level turn, the steps, and the stuff. That's the reflect part. And then the reconnect part is equally important. It's not enough just to say, okay, I learned so much from them, now I'm going to be better. But the reconnect is just closing the loop. It's just going back to them and saying, this is what I took from our interaction. Here's how it helped me see something new. Here's how I grew. Here's what I do about it. Thank you. Did I get it right? And just that closing the loop is so rare. It often doesn't happen, but it really sends the message to the other person. I value you. I value your time. And also I value so much what you taught me that I want to make sure I took the right lesson away. And you can give me a chance if I didn't quite take it away.
Well, and we're not going to be having these conversations with just one person, right? So I can appreciate we're having several conversations with similar outcomes and different levels of feedback that we're sifting. I mean, how does a person decide what to actually implement or take action on?
I mean, this is where the turning gives you a little bit of time and space just to think that through. Just the same way with curiosity, it can be a team sport. And so you can actually say to your team, here's 3 or 4 things that I took away. Can you help me make some meaning? What should we do about this together? You can do it with a thought partner. And then to your point that it's usually not just one person, you can do that reconnecting in a group format as well. In the book, I tell a story about how my co-CEO and I had heard lots and lots of input from people. And then at our annual retreat, we stood up and we said, here's some of the reflections that we had from what you shared with us. Here's how we pushed ourselves. Here's what we're going to do about it. And we did that in front of 100 plus people. And so it didn't have to happen one by one.
Yeah, that's good. Now, there are there's three other sort of categories, if that's the right terminology, Jeff. But I kind of think of them as categories of feedback, and you categorize them as like on the way, on the radar, or out of our hands. And
Yes.
it's kind of a way to put feedback into a queue so people kind of know where you're at. And I loved it for lots of reasons. One of them was I could see how that would help the receiver of the feedback not get overwhelmed with a whole bunch of commitments.
Yes. So this is an example of how you can reconnect with someone and say, here's what I'm doing with your feedback or your input. And how often do we fill out a survey or do we give someone feedback and we just wonder, did that go into a black hole? Is it going anywhere? And that's when employees become cynical about giving it in the future because they're like, well, they clearly didn't do anything with it this time. I don't
Yeah.
even know if they even read what I had to do. And so this is a method that allows you to go back to people and say, on the way, we're doing it. We heard it. Cool. And people respect that you're not going to necessarily be able to do things with every single one of the responses. So you can then say, and here's another category. This is
Yeah.
stuff that I actually think is important. I can't implement it right now, but it's on my radar.
Yeah.
And then thirdly, you had some great ideas. They are out of our hands right now. It is not something that we're going to be able to do. And just
Yeah.
those buckets allow you to be able to go back and let close the loop with people.
Yeah. One of my concerns is that employees can sometimes already have a pre-programmed, like a conditioned skepticism we're going to do anything with their input. My fear is if something stays on the radar for too long, employees start to think it's just a sneaky way of us kicking the can down the road. How do we avoid that?
Yeah, I think the way to avoid that is to explain why it's still on the radar, why it hasn't moved to on the way. To say to people, I know this is like the third meeting we've had where I've told you this thing is still on the radar. You may be wondering, why is this still on the radar? Let me tell you what's holding me back. Let me tell you what I'm still wrestling with. And by the way, let me ask you if you have any ideas for how to deal with that barrier that's keeping it still on the radar as well.
Yeah, that's good. And so you really have to keep an ongoing roster so that it's got visibility, so it's not going to get lost and forgotten. Jeff, another part of the book that I appreciated is that you give people like practical advice for, I call it deliberate practice, you call it leveling up, but it's really some tips and some guidance on how to start using these things so that we can become unconsciously competent and the messiness that is in the path before it. But I mean, I wonder if you could sort of give us an overview of what does it look like for somebody to start using this and to start implementing deliberate practice and leveling up.
Yeah. And I'll say this is the same set of things that you would use if you're trying to learn a golf swing, a new tennis swing, play a musical instrument. It's a human learning process that applies to really anything.
Yeah.
The first step of which is to realize that you don't even know what you don't know. And so if you're not using this right now, you might be, the fancy term would be unconsciously incompetent. And the first step of the learning process is to realize, hey, I'm not doing that. And that is, the term for that is consciously incompetent. And I think the term incompetence has a bad rap
Yeah.
because a lot of people think, well, I'm incompetent. That's a whole statement about my character. But there's, most things in the world I'm incompetent at, and so are you, and and that's okay. And at least now we know. And so then the next step is to actually become consciously competent at it. And to your point earlier about, the cue card of the questions, or going back to say, folding the page of the book and saying, all right, here's this one question. I just want to practice paraphrasing and testing. Let's just take that one as one example, since we talked about that earlier. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to try that out in an interaction or two. And if I'm consciously competent about it, it means I'm going to have to concentrate on doing it. But it also means that it might feel a little awkward at first, just the same way if I'm, throwing a ball in a different way, it might feel a little awkward at first. That's actually good. If you're feeling awkward, if you're feeling de-skilled, that means that you're on the path. And then to basically make it unconsciously competent, which is basically a fancy way to say you're making it natural, you're making it fluid. It's just a simple thing of practice, feedback, practice, feedback, practice, feedback. Try it, ask, see how it went. The feedback can just literally be what happened when I did that. Or you can even ask for feedback. Hey, I tried something new. What did that seem like to you? Either way,
Yeah.
practice
Yeah.
it again. And just go through that loop and then pick the next skill. and pick the next skill that you want to do it. And what I say in terms of leveling up is start in easy contexts. You don't need to try this out in your most high stakes meeting. You can do this with a friend. You can do this with a colleague. You can do this with your close in team. Let them know you're trying something new. And then leveling up is basically going through that same cycle again in a slightly more challenging context, in a slightly more challenging context. And next thing you know, you actually have a much broader repertoire and it feels much more natural.
All right. Now, at the risk of this being like ultra tactical, let's just say somebody goes to Mexico for a few days, they read your book on the beach, they get really inspired and excited. Of course, they come back to a flood of emails. But what might be like an example of what the first 5 days back to work might be for someone that's really trying to stick with this and implement your framework?
Yeah, so I'll say a couple of things. One is on the website, askapproach.com, there's an assessment, and it's a free assessment. It's the first thing you get to on the website, and it helps you to know which of these 5 skills you're strong in and which of these 5 skills you need to grow in. And so what I like to say is that one of the best things to do is start by seeing like, where do I want to grow most? And the assessment will take you no more than 5 or 7 minutes. But let's say that yours is curiosity. So then I would zero in and say, let me start to notice situations where I'm feeling righteous, where I'm feeling certain, where I feel like that, and just start to say, where can I inject a question mark? Where can I inject a question mark into the story that I have? Maybe that question mark I'm just going to inject is, what's some information I might be overlooking? And just sit with that question and try that question out for a couple of days. Or maybe for you, what it is making it safe. And so what you're going to try to do is you're going to think about, what's one thing I can do to make the other person feel safe? Maybe I'm going to use the strategy called radiate resilience, which is to let them know, hey, whatever you have to say, good, bad, or ugly, I really want to hear it, and I can handle it. And so you can decide which of the practices you want to start with, and then inside that chapter, just pick out one thing you want to start with.
Yeah, good, really good advice. Now, it occurs to me, like the least the lens that I'm looking through, and maybe it's just because of the position I have or whatnot, but I'm looking at through the lens of the person that has the power in the relationship applying these fundamentals. But so often it's just not the case, where it's the person that has the power that's not doing these things, and it's their colleagues that have the awareness they should do this. And we actually see this with the leadership teams we work with all the time, is that the CEO leaves after the planning day and the VP stay behind and talk about just how unaware the CEO is, but they're afraid to start broaching these topics. And so how would somebody effectively, I guess, manage up with your framework, Jeff?
Yeah, I think it's equally prevalent, but in different ways, that people who are in more junior positions are also missing out on learning things from the people above them, as it is that the people above them. I mean, I'll just give you in my own example. As a leader, I'm a leader who cares a lot about learning and feedback and growth. And yet I will confess, oftentimes I'll be in a meeting or watch somebody on my team. I will have an observation about them, something that could help them to grow. And I don't tell them because I'm rushing to the next meeting. And I'm moving on quickly, and all of a sudden my brain has moved on, and they're not going to get it from me. But I always say to them, listen, if you just pause me and ask me one question, ask me for input or feedback, I promise you I'll give it to you. And so one of the things when we're looking kind of quote upward in a hierarchy is to remember that the person above us might also be thinking and feeling things and not telling us, in part because they might not even feel safe telling us. They might not know how we're going to react as well. They might not want to have an impact on us as well. And so I would encourage people, no matter where you are, whether that's looking up or also with your clients as well, who may be thinking and feeling things and not telling you, or your investors, it works in all directions.
Yeah. This is a very recent example. I have a friend who spoke up to their child's coach. And my friend spoke up because they were afraid, they were kind of worried or concerned about the amount of time commitment that the sport was taking. And my friend's child is quite young, like, 10 years old or so. And there's now some evidence of some retribution towards their child. So now they're having to go and hopefully repair that relationship. But they spoke the truth. They spoke up. Like, do you have any tips when speaking up does backfire, how to mitigate the damage?
I mean, that's very real. It reminds me of a situation with my own kid's coach as well, where they were requiring my child to come to an extra whole category of practices and my kid was like, this is too much. And what I did in that situation, as I said, is, what's the reasoning behind this? What's the interest that you're trying to meet? What's the concern? And once I uncovered that, I was able we were able to together problem solve and say, here's what's going on. Once you've done it, and there might be some damage, I think the best thing that it can do is what you said. But perhaps one way to one way to approach it is to say, what was the impact I had on you when I raised that concern? And if it's an impact, it's likely not what I intended. But
Yeah.
to use the ask approach in some ways to just understand, how did I impact you as a coach who's probably or perhaps volunteering their time and making lots of extra sacrifices and really believes in my kid and might have taken it in a way that was different than I intended it, and have a little, sort of have that curiosity and empathy for where they might be coming from.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. I think that'll be helpful to my friend and lots of other people. And uh, high level, Jeff, you have such mastery of this material that comes through in spades. This has been such a helpful conversation to me personally, and I know everyone that's listening. But when it comes right down to it, fundamentally, and maybe we've sort of touched on it a bit, but maybe not as directly as I'd like to, is why are we so wired to be like afraid of people telling us the truth? Like, why is that a thing to begin with?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's one that kind of is at the heart of what motivated me to write the book. I think some of it is we just don't have the skills to ask. We don't even realize that there is something. And so a lot of what the ask approach can help us to do is to say, like, if you're motivated to know, but you don't know how to make it safe, or you don't know what the right question, like, no one's actually taught us how to do that. And so we end up keeping ourselves in the dark just out of lack of skill. So I think that's one piece of it. I think a second piece of it is what we touched on earlier, is that we don't realize there is something to learn from them. Because we're not curious enough, because we're stuck inside our own bubbles or our own, mental models, or the people who are keeping us certain as well. And then I do think that there is, there are situations where we might be afraid of the truth, or we might actually not know what we would do if we actually heard the truth from other people. And I respect that. And I think we all have to regulate our own sort of like, sensitivities and boundaries and all that kind of thing. And I'm not saying you should just go ask for everything without thinking it through or that kind of thing. But what I will say to people is, if the other person is thinking something like that, like, boy, that they've hurt you, you've hurt them, or they have a thought about how your strategy is about to go awry, whether you ask them or not, they're still going to be thinking that. And so wouldn't you want to know? Because at least then you can talk about it and then do something about it. And if the answer is yes, then the ask approach gives you a way to do that. And if the answer is, I'm not ready for that, I respect that too.
Yeah. Yeah. And I identify with that third piece, with the fear. I mean, as much as I understand it logically, the emotions behind seeking out the tough feedback, and I know if I was better at seeking it out, I'd be such a better leader. I'd be such a better colleague. Our business would be so much better. I understand all that stuff. I think I sometimes have this thing, I think, where I'm worried about letting people down, or I haven't been showing up the way that I want to. And but that would make it better, not worse. But it still doesn't make it easy to overcome that fear barrier sometimes.
I respect that, and I can relate to that too.
Jeff, you have dedicated a big portion of your life to making a big impact with the way that we learn, and predominantly like the way that children learn and the educational institutions. You co-founded a company called Transcend, which is dedicated to reinventing and modernizing every facet of kindergarten to grade 12. So thank you for doing that work. I can imagine how gratifying and impactful it is. I wonder if you could share a little bit of a snippet on how you're doing that.
Absolutely. So we work with communities, predominantly in the US at this point, that are basically saying, we don't want to keep doing school the same way we've been doing it. And if I were to connect it to the conversation we've just been having, we don't want to be educating kids in this, quote, industrial model of schooling that really hasn't changed in 100 years, that, this is my own editorial now, that basically shuts down curiosity. That says to kids, you just need to follow directions, sit down, shut up, get the right answer. We realize that we're living in this 21st century now, where we actually need kids to be creative, to do things that machines are not going to be able to do, to actually be able to work with other people, to be leaders. And that means that kids need a whole different set of experiences. They need to be doing things that feel relevant. They need to be learning how to take charge of their own education. They need to be working on real problems that have real consequences to themselves and their communities and people around them. They need to be developing not just their brain, but their social skills and their physical and all of that kind of stuff. And that means we need to think differently about the day-to-day design of school. And just the same way that the industrial design of school was a set of design choices at the time, we can make a different set of design choices about schedules, about curriculum, about educator roles, about how we use our resources, where learning even happens. And so Transcend, my organization, works with those communities who say, we're done with the industrial model and we want to actually create a better setup. And we walk them through a design process and support them to envision what they want and then build and pilot their way towards that.
Well, I can appreciate how gratifying and how challenging that work must be.
Both in equal measure.
Yeah, I'm so grateful that you're doing that. And Jeff, again, as I've said, I love this book. What did you learn about yourself in writing it?
I learned a lot about myself as a writer. I think I did learn that maybe this is probably the deepest thing that I learned, which is one of the things I had to work hardest at was to get the stories out of myself, and to really tell them in true, vivid detail and in the kind of detail that would, I think, compel people to want to really stick with the book and care about it. And I often had a story in my own mind that was like, why would they want to hear that from me? Are my stories even interesting enough to warrant people's reading them? And I think that's a lot of what has that has held me back, and I think holds a lot of people back from actually sharing what we think, feel, and know. And so I had to get over that hang up. And in doing that, I actually ultimately found myself much more self-expressed. But I basically had to pretend that people were asking me the very questions that I'm encouraging other people to ask as well.
Was there anything that was uncomfortable for you to share?
I would say that the most uncomfortable things are probably all the stories that are in the book about where I screwed up, where I missed the cues from my team or my family or loved ones. And, I will have a narrative that's like, well, are people going to see like, he's not a good leader. He's not a good, friend or husband or those kinds of things. So I had to get over that kind of thing. And I also had to reckon with my own identity, my own privilege, my own role in organizations, in society, and the ways in which that intersects with all the different issues, and how to talk about that in a way that's not apologizing for who I am, but is also recognizing the ways in which all of that intersects in interactions that I have.
Yeah, and I think that you wove that together admirably. And I think that all of the things that you shared, if you didn't think they were interesting, I'm telling you they are, and they were.
Thank you.
And all of the things that you thought might make people think less of you as a leader only made me think more of you. So
that means a lot. I appreciate that affirmation.
Yeah, it was a great book. Jeff, thank you. I have appreciated this discussion more than I can even tell you. Thank you so much for being here. I cannot wait to share this with our listeners. Where can people find you on the World Wide Web?
www.askapproach is the easiest way to find everything about the book, including the assessment that I talked about earlier. I'm also on LinkedIn, Jeff Wetzler, and on Instagram at askapproach.
All right. Jeff, thank you for joining us. And to the audience, a reminder just to stay curious, but maybe not so curious that you go searching for grizzly bear encounters.
There you go. Exactly.
Right on, Jeff. Thanks so much. We'll talk to you again. And to all of our listeners, thank you for being here, and we'll see you down the road. If you enjoyed this episode and found it helpful, don't forget to give us a 5-star rating and subscribe to our YouTube channel or wherever your favorite podcasts are found. And if you're part of a leadership team and you just know that your organization is capable of even better performance, please reach out to us at unleashresults.com for a conversation and to learn more about how we might help unleash the potential of your team and organization.